Just a very specific question on the growing number of UK departures that connect to long haul via our European rivals, which Daniel was talking about as well, that could mean we end up as a country station on a branch line, I think you said. I thought was a very good turn of phrase. What do you think the impact is on our economy and on our industry?
Well, aviation is an absolutely vital part of our economy, vital for employment, for GDP, and for the skills which are associated with the industry. So that's in general. And of course, in relation to tourism, it is absolutely critical. I think it's about 3/4 of the people who come to this country actually come by air. So it is absolutely critical, and we've got to maintain long-haul flights and also shorter-haul point-to-point flights as well. And I agree with some of the things that Daniel said, that we certainly do need a hub airport and to maintain a hub airport. And we also need to look at our regional capacity as well. It's a different market, but it's an essential one linked with tourism.
You pointedly said you agreed with some of what Daniel said. What didn't you agree with?
Well, I agree that we need a hub airport. I was a little concerned that it sounded to me as if Heathrow was being dismissed a bit. It's not really a hub. And I think we've got to find a solution to what's happening now, which is that Heathrow is actually losing out to other hubs, other European hubs, but it is still there, and we haven't got an alternative now.
Daniel, if the Boris plan went ahead, presumably that's toast for Heathrow. I mean, Heathrow would
No, Boris thinks Heathrow still has a role, but not as the major hub airport for the southeast. But there will still be an airport there, and there is still premium leisure travel that might well prefer to go to Heathrow because of its access to some of the very richest parts of the country. It's very close to places full of high net worth individuals and comfortably off people who might want to do their skiing holiday, whatever it is, by going to Heathrow. There's still a big market for that. And of course, it sits at the heart of a huge, what you might call, industrial and commercial complex, which is built up along the Thames Valley, which will still be there, much of it, because it's not all by any means huge corporations. Much of it is local and medium-sized businesses who will still have their aviation needs, both for their products and for their staff. And Heathrow will be extremely well placed to serve those. So I think it is a different airport, but I don't by any means think it means that Heathrow has to close.
Tim, what's your view as an economist?
Well, my view is that Heathrow will survive because it's the airport that's in the right location for the people who want to fly. And that's why I think even if built, Boris Island would struggle to get off the ground because the high net worth individuals who are travelling at the very front of the plane want to get in a cab and get home at the end of the day.
And those are the ones that Daniel mentioned, the ones that want to take advantage of developing nations and the growth in China and India and so on.
And they don't live in Chatham, where I grew up, which would be an easy cab ride away from Sheppey or the Isle of Grain. They live in Gerrard's Cross and that sort of place, which are close to Heathrow.
Daniel, do you want to take that point on?
I think clearly one has to, with any new airport, has to be built with the appropriate surface access. But the simple fact is, and I live in West London, I'm a councillor in Kensington, and it's very nice to go to Heathrow. But if the planes aren't actually flying from Heathrow to where I want to go, the fact that it's in a convenient location is not offering me a real choice. So there, clearly it would be lovely if you could actually solve everything in a way that met all of these demands. But Heathrow is not in a position, and London is not in a position to accept Heathrow growing to be the huge airport we probably need. So there will have to be some trade-offs around that. And surface access and rapid rail access to any new airport is, of course, absolutely crucial.
I want to move on to APD and bring Mike in. Presumably with the scarcity of seats, APD is going to continue to rise, and that's going to have even more damage on your industry, on your company and the industry as a whole.
Well, I think we sincerely hope that APD isn't going to continue to rise, certainly not in excess of inflation. And I think the question that John Penrose struggled to articulate the answer to in terms of what our industry really needs in terms of the outbound sector from government are three things. And, I'm tempted to say they're kind of APD, APD and APD, but certainly APD is right up there. Second is, as he kind of pointed out, it's the airport experience, and then it's the the kind of regulatory infrastructure and actually what that and a fair environment and fair competition for our industry. So APD, of course it's a continuing issue for us, and to the extent that it continues to rise, inevitably it has an impact, an ongoing impact upon us.
Luke, I just want to go coming back to Heathrow. We've had Justin Greening, Theresa Villiers, practically everybody saying the third runway is not really on the table anymore, even whilst they're saying there's a consultation going on. We know that Boris is against the third runway, but can you have this consultation that's finishing in the summer and reporting at the end of the year without proper consideration of a third runway?
Well, what we'd like to see the consultations deal with is the whole picture of UK aviation. That includes not only what happens to a hub, but what happens to point. And from ABTA's point of view, that means putting all the options on the table and letting people consider them, because it's not only about hub capacity, although that's really important. It's not only about point-to-point traffic, although that's really important. It's not only about regional traffic, although that's really important as well. You've also got the added dimension, which is implicit in what some of the government statements are saying about playing off leisure travel versus business travel. And that's a real concern, because it's not written in black and white in their policy statements. And you don't find Justin Greening making statements saying we will reduce the number of leisure routes so we can get those all-important business routes to the emerging economies in there. But there is something implicit in what they're saying about it. And the most important thing, finally, after that, is to not forget about the passenger in all of this. Because when you're talking about aviation stuff, it's very tempting to talk about miles and miles of tarmac and to talk about new ways of getting people through immigration. But it's actually the people queuing that we need to remember in these situations here. And the experience of using our airports is really important. But we also need to make sure that what the capacity picture for the future is reflects actually where customers want to use it. And that's really important. So that goes to the points that have been made along the panel. But I sometimes feel, and certainly from ABTA's perspective, that this can become too technical a debate so far that misses out on the consumer. And we need to put the consumer back at the heart of travel, because simply without the consumer, there's no one flying.
I can see a lot of nodding going on, so we're going to start at this end and work our way up to Louise, who I know also wants to get in.
Yeah, it's plain odd for the government to rule out extra runway capacity in the southeast, which effectively means all the capacity is going to be ending up for business travellers, while saying to people in the rest of the country, if you're a leisure user, you can fly as much as you like because there's plenty of airport capacity. So you can go on holiday if you live northwest of Watford, but not if you live southeast. I mean, that's just bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is essential for us, that we need to make sure that our voice as leisure and charter carriers is heard in this debate and heard as strongly as the scheduled passenger and business voice. That's absolutely critical, because the point is, of course, that if you are a leisure passenger, then you are an incredibly valuable commodity. We've seen the figures today that ABTA have started to publish in relation to the value that an outbound customer brings to the UK economy. And they all also bring great value, of course, to the airports, because the spend that a leisure traveller brings to the airport as he spends a couple of hours browsing the shops and buying the suntan lotion that he certainly wouldn't need if he was holidaying in this country is far, far greater than a business traveller would spend. And in addition to that, of course, what one has to consider when one thinks about capacity and constrained capacity is the extent to which, in fact, leisure passengers are the most efficient users of capacity, because, of course, largely and on average, they fly on larger planes and they fly on fuller planes. So, in fact, if you want to make the best use of airport capacity in the southeast of England, then dedicate it all to charter and leisure passengers.
Louise, is that a good suggestion?
The draft framework has been long delayed, and I must say I'm even wondering now if suddenly there'll be another slippage. And I think, again, it's about not wanting to face up to some of the difficult issues.
Well, the Secretary of State this morning did swear.
Did she actually
she swore blind, didn't she, that it was going to finish consulting in the summer, that her ambition was to publish it in March, but that she was secretly hoping, or not so secretly hoping, to get it published this year.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, relieved to hear that. But of course, it's to look at the aviation sector and have an effective policy means government looking across departments, and I think we heard a little about that before, and it's about the passenger experience as well. I mean, the queues at Heathrow and other airports at the moment over passport control are just one example of that. That sector's worked by the Home Office. the airport is the Department for Transport, and the two don't always work together, and other issues with Treasury to do with taxation. So there's got to be a closer working together of government departments as well as looking at a strategy.
And Louise, I just wanted to ask you, other suggestions have been, we could do more runways at Gatwick or Stansted, or we could use RAF Northolt, or get other satellite runways. Are any of those practical ideas, or are they ridiculous?
Well, no, I don't think they're ridiculous. They may be possible. I mean, in the Transport Select Committee, I mean, we're not government, we're cross-party, and we try to look at the issues. We will be looking at this whole area once that draft statement is actually published. And if the government rules things out, I suppose they're ruled out, but I think that we will want to look at all the possibilities, and those will be things that we would want to consider in the round.
Right, before I open it up to questions, Luke, there was one small question. The Finance Bill is set to devolve powers for setting APD on direct long-haul routes from Northern Ireland to ban B destinations. Is that something that the industry would like to see devolved further? I mean, can you see that that would have an impact on the UK as a whole?
I can, and I get quite excited about devolution to Northern Ireland, actually. And this is the reason why. There's some stunned faces in the audience, I can see them through the lights. It's because the reasons they're devolving air passenger duty to Northern Ireland are because it's having a negative impact on the economy. It's losing traffic to Dublin across the shared land border. It's affecting the economy in Northern Ireland. They were at risk of losing the only transatlantic flight from Belfast to New York, which is an actual linchpin of Northern Ireland economy. And because of this impending economic disaster in Northern Ireland, they acted and they devolved it for long-haul flights, and that's only a couple of flights every day. We want to see more. But the important thing about this is that they recognised in doing so that APD is having a negative impact on the economy. And so, when I was in Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago, I was saying to the Assembly, please do push on. Try and get more APD devolution here, because they recognise that it's a good way of encouraging more jobs, more investment in Northern Ireland if they lowered air passenger duty. Now, that example alone of what could happen if you do air passenger duty differently is something that we need to take up. We need to shine a spotlight on and actually say that could be happening in the rest of the UK as well. Why not look at it further? APD is having a damaging effect, and Northern Ireland could be the ones leading us out of this problem.
Actually, in the last session, we were talking about how there are no facts and figures on APD, that it's very difficult to lobby Parliament and say this is having a huge detrimental impact. Is that something that your think tank has looked at? Or?
The honest truth, although I'm looking for an exit behind me at this point, is that the total levy of APD is roughly equivalent to putting VAT on flying. VAT is not levied on aircraft or on ferries, for that matter, which are another under-taxed sector. So to be honest, you can all feel very virtuous in this room claiming you're overtaxed, but you're no more overtaxed than any other sector. I think there are sensible improvements we can make to the structure of APD, moving to a per-plane tax that's related to carbon emissions and which encourages higher load factor. But I think the chance of the industry getting APD reduced is zero. You might as well save your breath and go to the pub for half an hour.
I think that's the perfect opportunity to open it up to the floor. You're all a bunch of whingers. Now, who would like to kick off the questions to the panel? We'll have Simon at the front. Oh no, yes, we'll go to the gentleman there, and then if we take it down to Simon.
Hello, Henry Parker from Gatwick Airport. Very pleased to hear one mention of us in the entire airport capacity debate there. I had two questions for the whole panel, really. First question was, do they agree with the Prime Minister's recent assertion that Gatwick is emerging as a business airport to compete with Heathrow under new ownership? He said that quite clearly. He positioned us as a part of the solution to the problem that's facing the South East. What is your view? And then the second question would be, should not the short-term focus be on filling the existing capacity that is available in the London airport system? We can cater for 11 million passengers more per year than we currently do at Gatwick. We can support at least 40,000 more flights. And we can provide the links to emerging economies, including Vietnam, China, South Korea, and Hong Kong, who are all starting from Gatwick this summer. Should we not be working out how to encourage more of those links to emerging destinations and emerging economies from airports where, in London, they can be supported?
And are you addressing that to anyone in particular, or just...
I'd love to hear from the whole panel on that.
The whole panel. Right, well, let's get another few questions so we can batch them. Yeah, down to Simon, and then who on this side had their hand up? We'll get a microphone to you.
Hello. Mr. Moylan, I'd love to find out what the mechanism is by which you persuade Willie Walsh, the main stakeholder in terms of slots at Heathrow, to move his entire operation and workforce 40 miles east, given that Heathrow will remain open?
Okay, and are there any other questions here, or shall we? No? Oh, yes. Lady on the second row here.
Hi, Lucy Siebert from TTG. One for Daniel. If Boris Island were ever to go ahead, how long would it take to get planning and to build that and to get that operational?
Okay, well, let's start with Daniel. Do you want to take that one first? How long would it take?
Well, I don't know how long it would take. It would take as long as we wanted it to, really, because in China they can build an airport in 3 years, and we could do that. But we could equally choose to take 30 years over it if we wanted to, because we're very good at that too. So I think it is actually a question of the political will and the political leadership required. If I may say, there's a sort of assumption very often that the third runway is a short-term solution and a new hub airport is a desirable but somewhat dreamy and far-distant long-term solution. But actually, the permissions required for the third runway under the existing system are such that it will actually take a very considerable number of years for it to be built, starting again from scratch, which is in regulatory terms what they need to do. And we could easily squeeze down the time it would take to build a new hub airport if we wanted to. And the choice between them in terms of time is not as great as I think is often made out. It is very much a question of political will. How long do we want it to take as a country? And then we can deliver it. We're good at delivering things once we know what we're doing.
Simon's point about moving the workforce, if Heathrow stays open, how do you get the X thousand staff to work at the hub?
There are issues about staff, and there are some of the staff are very specialist and probably would need to move, and there are other staff who could be drawn from and give jobs to people in the Kent and Essex economies. And I think a lot of thought needs to go into that, because when the people of Kent say, as some of them do, not all of them, oh, this wouldn't be environmentally welcome, I actually say to them, you know, I'm on a local authority, I've done environment, I've done planning. You shouldn't be thinking about the environment, because that's a minor issue compared to the planning consequences of having a new airport, the new accommodation, the schools, the hospitals, and all the things you would need in order to be able to service that with the right mix of skills. That's an even bigger problem and a bigger transformation, but it would bring great wealth to that part of the country if it did that. Willie Walsh is a man who knows his own mind. He won't necessarily be there forever. British Airways is a great airline, but then again, being probably the oldest person here on the panel, I remember the great airlines of my youth, Pan Am, TWA. Nobody had ever heard of Emirates when I was young, because it didn't exist, and so on. So we have to think, not only is our economy and our aviation economy changing over the next 5 or 10 years, not only are the sort of planes we're going to be using in 5, 10, 15 and 20 years are going to be different. We know that already because they're being built and they're being fed into the fleet. But also it's the case that airlines change and the rules about which airlines can operate in which countries, they can change too. So we mustn't imagine and get fixated on the idea that aviation development in this country is entirely at the behest of a single airline. Things change. I wish British Airways every success, but they will need to go to the places, and one of those places might be Madrid. I would rather it was somewhere else serving London. They need to go to the places where they can provide the connections for their passengers. I'd rather it wasn't Madrid. I'd rather it was somewhere in London. Willie, come on, wake up, realise that your future is here in the Thames Valley.
A message to Willie, if maybe he's following us on Twitter. Tim, you seem to be nodding there with what Daniel was saying about the general economy of aviation.
Oh, absolutely. We do need increased capacity. We can use existing capacity, but the projections are that it will run out by 2030. Given how long in practice it takes us to do anything big in Britain, if we don't actually make a decision on where we're going to have new runway capacity in the next 5 years, we will actually run out of capacity before we've finished the expansion. In terms of Gatwick, I think you've done very well in the last couple of years. You have improved the airport, but you're not a business airport. I mean, with all due respect to EasyJet, which is my preferred carrier within Europe, you are an EasyJet airport primarily catering to leisure passengers. There is no example anywhere in the world of a single runway airport that is a significant hub. That's the reality. That's not going to change. It's because of the reasons you said at the beginning about waves of planes landing and taking off. There is no chance of Gatwick being a major business destination unless you build another runway.
Daniel, and then Luke.
If I could just comment on the Gatwick question. I have great admiration for Gatwick, and I have huge admiration for the Prime Minister. And if the question is, was the Prime Minister right? The answer is, of course, yes. But the question put to the Prime Minister was, is Gatwick succeeding as a business airport compared to Heathrow? And he said yes, but that's not the right comparison. The right comparison is Gatwick succeeding as a business airport compared to Amsterdam and Paris and the airports that we are actually in competition with for real hub capacity. And it is not now, and may or may not be in the future, anywhere near that league. But then, if I may say one final point on that, then there's the question about using our existing capacity better. And it's always the airports with spare capacity who say this. All airports are businesses in this country. They're profit-seeking businesses. When they say they've got spare capacity, what I want to say to them is, what are you doing wrong in your business that you have got spare capacity? But I don't normally ask that question because I don't want to be rude. But they're always assuming, the people from Birmingham say just the same, that all you have to do is move the passengers to their airport. But we're not exporting prime cattle. These are customers in a market. And they don't just move to Birmingham because somebody has said, we're moving the leisure travellers to Birmingham or to Gatwick or to Stansted. They're free agents in a market, and they want to go to an airport that serves them properly.
Sorry, carry on.
Well, I was just to add to that point, I mean, and to take issue slightly with the concept that Gatwick is an EasyJet airport, we have 1.4 million passengers a year travelling through Gatwick, and many of them, of course, live locally to Gatwick, which is exactly your point. It's a local airport for local people.
Luke, you wanted to come in on the great Gatwick debate.
I do, and I fly at Gatwick quite frequently, and myself and Henry have good debates about aviation capacity. I think there's a danger of specifying a passenger and a whole plane as this is all leisure and this is all business. Now, in some cases, that is the case. Often, it's not. The mix of a plane will compose of people that are flying for business purposes, for holiday purposes, and for visiting friends and relatives. And if you look at the business mix at, Heathrow, it's roughly about a third each of those ones there. So it's 2/3 of people travelling through our main business hub airport, if you buy into the logic that sometimes comes from government, are flying for leisure purposes. Now, we need to go a little bit more detailed on this one here, because the whole problem, and the reason we really need this aviation policy published soon, is that all too often we can have a pub-style debate about aviation policy, saying, oh, we can just move people here, we can do this, we can just change this around. We need the facts and figures to be published by government so we can actually take proper decisions based on the evidence that's coming out here, because actually composite flying is by and large what most planes taking off from the UK have, part business, part leisure, part VFR market, and we need to have a debate that recognises there's a value, just as Stephen's presentation did earlier about the value of outbound, there's a value in business travel, there's a value in leisure travel, and there's a value in people visiting their friends and relatives, both here and abroad.
Well, I think it's only fair to give Henry a right of reply.
Very briefly, I would just say...
Oh, there's a microphone coming.
Very briefly, I would just say the UK does need a hub. We do not claim to be one. And what we are saying is that the dynamic of the aviation market is showing that we can attract routes on a point-to-point basis to key destinations that the UK is not connected to at the moment. Now, we cannot replace Heathrow, and I take Tim's point, and it's not something that we are seeking to do. Very finally, I would say, you're quite right, we can't order passengers around the UK. In our view, the UK's airports market should be fully competitive. It should be deregulated economically in our context. Some airlines may not agree with that. We see the key to our growth and the key to competing as a business airport to the removal of that regulation.
Okay, I think we've got time for just a few more questions. So we'll have the lady in the front row here, if we can have microphone 2, and then we're going to have microphone 1 here. Got probably time for 1 or 2 more, and then we'll need to wrap up this session. Right, let's just take those 2. So we'll have Madam first.
Christine Farnish, I'm on the ABTA board. I also chair Consumer Focus. And I'd like to pick up on this point we've just been talking about, and which came out, I think, of Justin Greening's remarks earlier. It sounded a bit as if, earlier this morning, one of the ways in which government's now thinking about managing this capacity deficit we're going to have in the southeast for the next 20 years or so, from the sound of it, is to start to segregate, and for premium travel, the business community, the hub traffic, and the top end of the leisure market to be given the best facilities, and for consumer leisure travel to get some sort of second-rate deal. And I really worry about this. Sitting here this morning, it's the first time this penny has really dropped in my mind that this is the way in which policymakers are starting to think. I think it's very disturbing, and I'd like to hear the panel's comments on their views on whether or not it would be a good thing if that happens, and if not, what we should do about it.
Lovely. We'll take the last question and then come back on that, Christine.
Okay, Darren Campbell, Airport Operators Association. We obviously campaign for all our airports. We want vibrant point-to-point airports, which have a decent planning regime, a different regulatory regime, and hopefully that will come out in the sustainable framework that's published by March. The call for evidence is something separate, so we don't have a deadline on hub. We don't know when we're going to have a decision on it. And what I'd be interested to find out from the panel is whether you think, as Luke was suggesting, that it's going to be an evidence-based process, it should be an evidence-based process, or how much is it going to be politics that decides what happens, or if anything happens at all?
Okay, well, that's the final question. So why don't we try to take both Christine's point of we're going to see a second-class citizen in aviation, and the point on the call for evidence and how political it's all going to be.
I think there's no doubt it's a political decision. I mean, aviation is entirely controversial. It is something which politicians, by and large, are scared of addressing. So actually, it is one of the reasons why a lot of people from a cross-party basis have a lot of respect for Boris Johnson, and because he's actually grasped this. And we need more of our national politicians to grasp the aviation nettle, to say, actually, it is important we have a proper debate here. And it is important we look at the evidence as well as the politics within there. Because I think there's a danger that the easy solution is a cheap political solution. We don't need that. We need the right solution. And it needs to be agreed across the board between the different political parties so we don't have a ping-pong between different administrations of different colours in the future. I think to Christine's point about aviation being segregated in the future, well, to a certain extent, higher APD is already affecting the ability of people, especially at the lower socioeconomic brackets, to afford to fly. Now, we need to have aviation affordability as part of a look at the long-term future for aviation capacity and the aviation future, because you can't just simply talk about tarmac without talking about people's ability to afford to fly in the first place. And if this is to be code for somehow managing capacity because we price people out of the market, that's certainly something that I think ABTA and our members have a concern about, because we want to see everyone to be able to fly and enjoy a holiday and to take business travel.
Tim?
You're quite right. This is how policymakers are thinking. They're trying to separate out hub flights from point-to-point flights, business from leisure, etc. But it doesn't work because, as you said, almost every flight has a mix of people. Although I should say the revenue mix is not the same as the number of bums on seats. The revenue mix at Heathrow is much more strongly business than the one-third, one-third, one-third. What we need in Britain is evidence-based policy making. What we get in Britain and in almost every other country in the world, to be fair, is of course policy-based evidence making. I've done a lot of work for government over the years. I co-authored one of the background reports to the Eddington report, and the publication of my paper was held up for 3 months because I used the words "the poor" in quotation marks describing Edwin Chadwick's view of the expansion of the railways. Labour didn't talk about the poor. They asked me to change it to people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. Since it was a quote I refused, we had a 3-month standoff before coming to a compromise. That's the reality working with this government, the past government, and every government, past, current, future, in Britain and every other country. Sorry.
Cheerful.
Well, follow that. So, Christine, I think it is a concern, and I think I come back to the point that we need to make sure that the leisure and charter model and the voice of that industry is heard in this debate and heard strongly, because Gatwick is a local airport for local people, and we need to make sure that it remains so and that hardworking families continue to be able to take holidays from Gatwick Airport and any other airport and regional airports that they feel the need to. And of course, there's an environmental point about that, because of course, what we don't want is people having to travel vast distances to reach an airport in order to take their holidays. I mean, that would be madness, of course. And then the second point, well, yes, evidence or policy or politics. Well, in the end, of course, it's both, I guess. But if we don't produce the evidence to support our views, then we've got no chance. So let's make sure we do the bit that we can control.
Louise.
Well, you ask if decisions can be taken away from politics. Not possible. I think that whatever you think about the third runway, I think in the end, that was dropped because of the political issues around the general election of 2010 and hasn't been picked up since because of a coalition agreement. I think whatever the merits or otherwise of that, I think that is really why now it is apparently being ruled out, whether it's considered a viable alternative or not. And I don't think you can ever really remove that. But what I think can be done and should be done is that the aviation sector should be much more proactive in promoting what it does and how important it is. Because what started to come over, maybe not so much at the moment, certainly a couple of years ago, was a negativity about the aviation sector. It'd be seen as environmentally unfriendly, something only for the rich, something that needn't really be there. And I never felt there was a real fight back and positive campaign coming from the sector itself, and I think it's vital that that is done. If I can go to the other question that was asked here, yes, I'd be very concerned if we were going to look at separate sectors as if they weren't all part of an interconnected industry. So we need to look very carefully at what's being said, and I look forward to hearing all your comments when we have our inquiry in the Select Committee, which no doubt we will have once the government's published their intentions.
Excellent. Daniel, the final word.
Well, actually, I very much agree with, in fact, just say a comment about the industry first. I very much agree with what Louise said about the industry not fighting back. I've never come across an industry that has so many different representative groups, none of whom seem to represent anybody very much, except one small sector. And the other astonishing thing is they all begin with A or B. So you can never actually remember, you can never actually remember what they are anyway by just looking at the acronyms, because they're all so similar. And I think you really have to, the business has to get itself together in order to make its case properly. And there needs to be a bit more coordination amongst them. I want to answer the question you raise. It is a matter of huge concern that policymakers are thinking this way, not because we're going to end up, as a result, with all the rich people flying from one place and the poor people flying from sort of sheds somewhere, whatever, because it will never happen. I've just said, you cannot tell the airlines you will take these passengers and not those passengers, because they're private businesses. If they're not making a profit, they won't fly at all with any passengers. You cannot tell the airports in this country, which are not state utilities, you cannot tell them what to do, and most of all, you cannot tell the passengers what to do. The concern is not that it will happen. The concern is that politicians will think they've got a solution and waste 5 or 6 or 10 years pursuing that solution because it looks like one and it looks like an easy one. And at the end of 5 or 10 years, we're no further forward. And in this respect, although I have the highest regard for our regional airports, they are constantly being told by the regional airports, all you have to do is make the passengers come to us, and you've solved the problems. So it is the regional airports that are very often providing them with what purports to be evidence for this chimerical proposal, which is never going to turn out to be a solution to anything. The real tragedy, the question about is it politics or is it evidence, it's partly a matter of leadership. And I'm very grateful to Luke for acknowledging that Boris has been willing consistently over the last 4 years to put his head above the parapet on this and offer some leadership. Lord Fowler, who was here earlier, to whom I was speaking, remembers clear as a day supporting in 1971 the proposal to build a new hub airport at Maplin. And this has gone on without leadership and without direction now for far too long. The government has an opportunity to seize it. My worry is that they won't. And if they don't, we will genuinely have lots of short-haul flights to Paris and Amsterdam, which is where we will join that aviation super-connected highway, and it will not be in Britain anymore, and it will have very serious consequences for us, and it is a real prospect in the near future if we don't take action soon.
Well, on that note, I'd like you to thank our panel, and we'll move on to our final session of the day.